Welcome to Calumet Perspectives. I'm Tom Roach. To my immediate right is Dr. Neil Nemeth, Professor of Communication, and to Neil's right is Lee Artz, Dr. Lee Artz, Professor of Media Studies. Lee is the author of the book War, Media, and Propaganda, and we thought we would devote today's show to news framing. Maybe to get that started, framing is, in other words, the context that the news is presented in. Is that a good place to start? And I think Lee is going to point out to us that when we're talking about things like what's going on in the Ukraine or Venezuela, sometimes the foreign policy causes assumptions to be used that frames the news in ways that affect how we interpret it. Lee, is that right?
Yeah, I mean, Neil can talk about this too. He's the journalist professor. But right. When we talk about framing, it's not just simply, I've been framed, right? I mean, like you see in some old black and white movie. Right. But it's actually a theory from a communications scholar named Robert Entman that talks about framing and how the selection of certain information, images, pictures presents a view of reality for us, and by omitting other pictures or narratives or images, we would miss out on that reality. I would say if we looked at today in Venezuela, you could look at the New York Times. Over the last 4 or 5 weeks, there's been a story almost every day in the New York Times, and I think we could reasonably say that the choices that the New York Times has used to cover the events in Venezuela frame it in such a way that we get a very selective picture of what's happening in Venezuela. Framing defines the problem, framing diagnoses the problem, framing makes an evaluation of the problem, and then it makes prescriptions, remedies. So if we were to say in Venezuela the problem is a government crackdown, government corruption, attack on the peaceful protesters, oh God, I don't want that, I'm against that. We should put an end to that, and the U.S. should intervene to stop this government put down of the peaceful student demonstrators.
Okay, well, so if we could take that for a second. Now, Neil and I are both former journalists as well. We both teach journalism, and I know from my experience, and Neil, you can address this too, I know that in the newsrooms I worked in, no one felt like they were consciously trying to manipulate the framing when they were writing a story. Now, so I think it might be useful to talk about how that happens, but what's your experience with that?
Well, the challenge from my perspective is that you're always looking for somebody as an authoritative source, somebody who at least appears to know what they're talking about. And typically that means people who are in power and people who are in authority, for better or worse. And so I think you get to see those sorts of perspectives reflected perhaps out of proportion to the actual event. It's also true that those people tend to be more easily accessible. They have a viewpoint they want to get across. If you're pressed for time and you don't have the resources, you go to the easiest place to get the information. I'm not suggesting that as necessarily the right way to do things. In fact, when I teach, I try to encourage people to go beyond all of that and try and get as well-rounded picture as possible. That said, it's impossible with the resources at hand to tell the complete story. You want to get as complete a picture as you can, but there are some serious limitations in the reporting method that I think the common person, because they're not aware and have never been in a situation where they've had to gather information, they're just not aware of the challenge of getting as complete an account as possible.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily put this on the level of the journalist. I mean, I think both of your experience, you go out and you do the job. On the other hand, I think sometimes when you're given a story, you're told that the story has to have certain elements to it, and I'm not sure what
actually, I just don't know of that actually being the case. I think that one of the points that Entman made is that there are rules of objective journalism that you kind of have to follow, and one of them is you have to interview an expert. There are exceptions where they do man-on-the-street interviews and things like that, but if you're doing a story in foreign policy and you're in Washington, D.C., I think Entman said there's probably only a pool of about 60 people that you could interview
Well,
for
yeah,
a given story, and they all went to Georgetown for for graduate school, and they've all worked in the in the network for a while, and so there tends to be a kind of a conformity of opinion, a broad conformity of opinion there, and it tends to put the United States interests first and things like that, and so a reporter might want to get outside of that and have a difficult time doing it. But I just don't, and I think it's more things like that that end up, governing how this happens than it is anyone telling a reporter, you need to cover it from this point of view. Unless we're talking about Fox News or something that's more,
well, yeah, okay. I would think that the Fox News journalists are going to have the same position you're expressing here. Nobody tells me what to say, and they don't. But unless they've already decided what they're going to say, they probably don't get hired at Fox News.
Well, we need to...
Or don't aspire to work at Fox News.
We need to acknowledge, though, that there's this tradition of the objective press, not that it's actually objective, but that they're following that tradition. And there's a new, innovation now the last, few years where we're getting a partisan press. And I'm not talking about the partisan press. I'm talking about the places like the New York Times where they're still
Which is why I'm focusing on the New York Times.
Okay, fine, go ahead.
I'm focusing, and I'm going to tell you a little story. When I was in Nicaragua, after Somoza was overthrown, I'm in Nicaragua at the Sandinista Revolution.
This was in the 1970s.
This was 1980. I'm sitting in the Intercontinental Hotel. I'm having my huevos rancheros right here. And at the table over there is the New York Times reporter, the newspaper of record. Okay? The next morning, on the front page, column 1, New York Times, is an article by that young man talking about a demonstration at the Ministry of Labor. He didn't leave his table. He gave an objective report, probably because he had an authentic source.
Most of the time, reporters don't report things that they actually saw. They report things that other people saw by interviewing them, right?
So this is where I'm headed. And the New York Times, in my mind, is one of the most egregious problems here because it has this aura of being the objective newspaper of record, or even worse, the liberal paper. I published an article in this book about the New York Times coverage of the Iraq War. The first 2 weeks of the war, the New York Times had a center spread, including a full-color thing, layout, full color, inside. It would have like the, picture of the naval vessel. But I simply looked at the New York Times and I looked at the graphics, the pictures and the graphics. In 2 weeks, 8-page spread, there was 68 pictures of soldiers at the ready, which means they're standing around talking to each other. 49 pictures of prisoners of war and their families. 36 maps and charts. 28 pictures of Iraqi civilians either fleeing or waving happily. 21 pictures of U.S. officials. 10 pictures of Kurds. A whole number of pictures on drawings of military equipment. 2 weeks of the war. There was not one picture in the New York Times of the war. You wouldn't know that there was a war. On the very first day,
let's explore that. So why is that? What's your hypothesis? And let's all take a shot at it. How do you explain it?
Well, I think part of it is the journalists that get assigned aren't going to be the ones that they think are going to go out of their way to find an objective news report.
Who's they?
The New York Times publisher. The New York Times publisher assigned that man to sit in the restaurant in Nicaragua. He didn't even speak Spanish, but they assigned him there because he would ask the proper people the proper questions. I'm picking on the New York Times, I understand, but
I just want to say, I mean, if somebody who's worked in a newsroom, I just don't know of a mechanism whereby a publisher calls a editor or reporter and says, send somebody who's sympathetic to this cause out there to do that. Now, I realize if we're going back to the days of William Randolph Hearst, when he was, trying to...
What happened to Peter Arnett just 10 years ago? Well, the CNN pulled him because he wasn't staying where he was supposed to be. They fired him.
But is that driven by their sense of the market, or is that driven by somebody's politics? There's a difference.
Peter Arnett won the awards. He made CNN what it was because he actually went out and did it. How are you going to fire Peter Arnett?
And he had legitimate print experience before he got into television.
Yes.
Well, I'm not going to defend the Peter Arnett decision, but I'm just saying, I mean, as a matter of routine, right? I just think that probably is not the way it happens at the prestige newspapers. Now, some of the other ones, I don't know.
Well, I don't know how it happens. All I can go is by the empirical evidence of what does happen.
Well, Neil, how would you explain the statistics he just gave us?
I think, and I hate to move this in a different direction, I think part of the challenge today is the resources are not there to cover in the detail that they've been in the past. Particularly if you look at the broadcast networks, a lot of the quote-unquote reporting that's being done is of the person whose face that you see is being stationed in London or some other place, and what they're doing is relying increasingly on stringers who are out in the field, both for video and actual reports that are going on. You have, just because of the cutbacks in the resources, they're not on the scene, even to the extent that they were in the period that you were talking about. With a handful of exceptions, the New York Times being one of them, foreign news has been cut back at most of the...
They don't have news desks.
They don't have those desks anymore.
So how this happens, Tom, I can't tell you. I think somebody should investigate. Part of it certainly is there's less resources, so there's not even as much investigation going on. So you can't look at the investigation to fault it because none is taking place. And then when there's a situation like in Venezuela, the reporter that goes there is going to go where they're most comfortable. We'll talk about that in a minute, but about where they go, who they talk to, who they consider experts, and who they don't. And in that whole process, you're getting what Entman calls selection of news to make it salient, because you repeat certain stories from certain sources that create a certain vision of the reality.
And that touches on the issue that there's a consensus amongst reporters sometimes on a story that influences it, and there can be a consensus in the community or in the nation as a whole, which is going to influence it, right? So there's a, I think the main drive on the part of most reporters is to get as close as they can to what they think is the truth, but I think that they are making subconscious decisions sometimes that that are based on what they think people want to hear or what they think people think is most important.
John Dewey has a phrase called occupational screen, that dependent on your occupation, you see the world in a certain way. Police officers tend to see people breaking the law.
Yeah.
Social workers tend to see people they need to take care of. Ministers tend to see people that are sinning and need to be saved, right? And journalists tend to approach most stories with a certain amount of question. They got a certain amount of, I don't want to say cynicism, but a good breadth of, how do I know that this is true? Then I think on top of that, you don't work your way up in any profession, including journalism, unless you're able to either subconsciously or even slightly consciously knowing what you need to do to continue to get published and get those stories.
Yeah, and we police ourselves to some extent, knowing that we're going to get ourselves in the hole sometimes, right? So, all right, well, with that, we'll take a break and we'll be right back. Welcome back to Calumet Perspectives. We're having a vigorous discussion about news framing. In other words, how does the way the story is framed influence the way we interpret the story? I'd just like to bring up, briefly at least, what's going on in the Ukraine right now. They just had an election to decide whether or not they wanted to reunify with Russia, and supposedly the reunification measure passed with 93% of the vote, but as the story's being reported, and as I'm seeing it anyway in a brief sampling, there's a lot of focus on all of the Russians that have been coming over the border, and stories about people's children voting and people voting twice and things like that. And this sort of reminds me of what the Republicans were saying when Obama carried Indiana. They were making accusations about everybody was voting twice in Hammond and things like that. So, so we, in the case that that we're looking at here in the Ukraine, you have a fact that's being reported. An election was held, a vote was taken, and the vote came out 93 to 7% or whatever, however that worked out, right? But the result of that vote is being colored by a lot of additional information that's being added to it. Now, the question is that information being added because we don't like the way the vote came out, right? Or is it being added because it's true and it's relevant, and maybe it's possible that a vote that's as strong as that, right, could still be skewed? What do you make out of that? Any thoughts?
Well, the real story is often more complex than we want it to be, for better or worse. You know, any story, and you've done this, Tom, in your own reporting, you only get part of the truth.
Right.
The part of it that's probably the easiest to come up with. The plain fact of the matter is it sometimes takes a long time for, assuming that we get to the truth, there are so many obstacles that have to be overcome. People are not available. People lie to you. People, documents are perhaps mistakenly put together. There are a whole host of things that can go wrong in the reporting process.
People on one side of the issue can be available to be interviewed, and people on the other side of the issue perhaps aren't, right?
Yeah.
That will skew it
And
as
you'll
well.
tell us
right?
from a public relations standpoint that that's not such a good thing.
Well, it's good if you're the PR person, because you just take full advantage of that and make sure your people are available and, you know, getting back to the reporters right away.
Yeah.
I think increasingly the PR of governments and other interests makes things more or less available and provides the copy points or the sources or the frames that are easy to pick up, particularly when there is, in the case of the Ukraine, for instance, I think it would be very difficult to find a US or a UK reporter that is sympathetic to the Russians or the Crimeans. So as soon as you say 93%, they're going to get a face like you just got. Yeah, oh, yeah, 93%. Are you kidding me?
Can you manufacture 93% of the vote? Is that
Well, if I was going to
possible?
manufacture it, I certainly wouldn't try to manufacture 93. I might go with 75, 80,
Yeah.
right? So if you're saying it's, but to me, the more important thing is how it continues to be covered in a particular fashion, what they use to define it, and what they use to repeat over and over and over again, and who the sources are. And once that frame is set, after that, it's kind of secondary what the details are. Once you have, once you've declared that Crimea's breakaway because of Russian intervention, all of the details that come after that are secondary because you've already got in your mind how it's to be understood.
But it's complicated because some people are tracking all of that, and it's not going to influence them as much, right? And some people are just looking at it peripherally, and so they're going to be much more influenced by the frame, right? But to get back to what we were saying about public relations people, so we would all acknowledge then that the process sometimes can be manipulated by people from the outside, not necessarily.
Can?
Yeah, well,
I would say in
often
almost
is,
every
right? Yes.
situation.
Well,
yeah,
often is. So it's
And
not just
for evil purposes. People want to put
Yeah.
out their best face.
Absolutely.
Every
Yeah.
single time.
And just as you have a right to hire an attorney for
Well,
a courtroom, you have a right to hire a public relations person for the court of public opinion.
The problem
right?
is, but the problem is
Yeah.
presumably we live in a democracy. And when you get to the point where the government is hiring people or doing a framing that distorts that, I don't think that, it's just a way of doing business.
Which is what we're assuming is going on in the Ukraine right now. With
Well,
the,
I'm not,
with the
I
Russians.
know little
Sorry.
about the Ukraine, but if you wanted to talk about Venezuela, I know there's a strategic plan for Venezuela that the National Endowment for the Democracy had in last fall that included things like, they even said, we'll target CNN, we'll target the Associated Press, we're going to make sure that they get the information that we
Right.
want.
Yeah.
And then when
That's basic public relations
and
strategy. right?
the interesting thing to me is when the guy from the New York Times goes to Venezuela, he doesn't go to Caracas. He doesn't go to where the majority of the people have voted for the Maduro government. He goes to San Cristobal, which is an elite, upper middle class suburb, and that's the only place he gets his information from. I mean, you're in a country where Jimmy Carter, the Carter Center, said it's the most extraordinary electoral process I have seen in my life. And this is the same process that Kerry says is a distortion of democracy. And then when the New York Times frames it by violence, corruption, shortages, and where's the source coming from? It's coming from one community, not another
But
community.
Lee, why do you think that happens?
Yeah, that's the question.
Well, It happens because the United States government represents most of the major corporate interests in this country.
But you just acknowledge, though, that the corporate interests can also be hiring public relations people to spin it from their side as well, right?
But their side and the U.S. government side happens to be the same in most cases.
Well,
Lee,
I don't
would it
doubt
have
that,
anything
yes.
to do with the viewing public wanting a certain product, so to speak? In other words, not wanting to hear about the problems of poor people in Venezuela.
Well, the interesting thing is the rich people are protesting and the poor people support the government. It would seem to me that poor people in this country would like to know, how can we get out of poverty?
Yeah, but
I mean, no,
but,
wait,
whoa, no, wait, Lee. But I mean, the people don't watch that stuff. I mean, look how most people spend their time watching
so
TV.
you're
Look at what they're
saying-
watching.
you're
Are they
saying-
watching stories? Are they watching things on
You're saying
public
the U.S.
television about
government is doing
Appalachia?
this to make the entertainment needs of the American people
No, Neil
happier.
and I are pointing out that reporters are covering, it's a market-driven industry. Reporters are covering things in a context that they think is going to be most palatable and interesting to the people who are buying their newspapers and watching their news shows.
And, more importantly, of interest to advertisers.
Yes, and-
advertisers want the focus
Oh.
on their
Oh, yeah, no,
advertising.
you're
They do
digging the hole
not-
deeper.
They do not want, if you buy this viewpoint, the idea is that the commentary should not obscure the advertiser's message.
Well, I think that's true. I also think that at times, though, news reporters, news agencies, the New York Times, Associated Press, understand that they're selling audiences to advertisers, but part of the product that they're selling is presumably this objective, balanced reporting on the political affairs of the world. And I'm not sure of the process. I think it's an interesting question, but I am absolutely sure of the outcome. The outcome of the coverage of Venezuela or the Ukraine or Egypt ends up selecting news, repeating that news, repeating those sources that, for whatever reason, you can draw a line between the interests of the U.S. government and the interests of Exxon, or the interests of U.S. government and the interests of GM, or the interests of U.S. government and AIG. I don't care. I'm not into a conspiracy.
We all know, no, but it doesn't need to be a conspiracy. We all know what those relationships are. I don't think that's news to anybody at this point.
No,
But-
here's what's the news.
Yes.
The news is that they focus on corruption and sabotage and shortage, and they don't focus on the fact that there's been 15 elections in the last 16 years. They don't focus on that 75% of the people in the municipal elections just voted for the Chavista government. They don't focus on the fact that poverty is the lowest of any country in Latin America. Instead, the New York Times headline 2 days ago was, "It's more deadly in Venezuela than in Iraq."
Okay, well, let's just
Listen to this. It's more deadly in Venezuela than in Iraq. That's their headline. That is news framing. That's not accurate.
Well, unless they really believe that.
I'm not interested in what people believe. I'm interested in what they report. Because if I only care are they believing it, then you can find yourself some,
Well, look, let's...
you can find yourself a member of the Ku Klux Klan that will
look at
talk
it.
about race and he believes it. I don't care what he believes. If it's not accurate, it's not accurate.
Well, but if he believes it's accurate, then that's the point I'm making. But I mean, let's look at this in terms of something that's a little simpler. Look at the coverage of this this flight that disappeared from Malaysia, right? The news could be telling us about the wonderful history and culture of this country. We could be getting information on the news. Maybe they've got a wonderful school system,
And here
right?
in
But
this
we're not getting that, are we? We're hearing about how the government is
And we don't care. The only reason they do it is exactly what Neil said. It draws people to it. There's a crash. It disappeared. It's like Ghostbusters on TV or something. So they'll sell
And the
audience.
same people that watch Ghostbusters are the same people you're
It's a
trying to sell those news shows to. Think
live
about it.
mystery.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
So
and it doesn't
to that
matter.
extent-
And
it
that's the
doesn't-
audience. Yeah.
No, but that doesn't matter. If we're going to be professors here,
Yes.
trying to teach our students to be citizens and to be interested in controlling the world they live in,
Yes.
we can't wash our hands of it like Pontius
No, not at all.
Oh, that's what people want. Give them a mystery. We don't care if they've distorted the news in Venezuela and the U.S. Marines will land there in 6 months.
But
we
the
do
difference
care.
is The difference is I'm not teaching citizenship and political science. I'm teaching
Aristotle
communication.
is rolling over in
and
his
for
grave.
me, for me, I want, I want people to understand how these processes work, and I want them to be able to
But you have to do that.
pursue careers, and I want them to be able to
have
make
to do that.
ethical choices when they're doing
Oh,
that. Yes.
well, you do come to the ethics.
Yes.
Tom, I'm going to disagree with you because I do teach civics.
Yes.
It's important. It's a bedrock principle in reporting. If we do our jobs well, we are giving people information that they can use to make informed decisions about where to live, where to send their kids to school, the quality of the drinking water, the quality of the air, those sorts of things that matter in the course of public life. To be active participants, you've got to have good raw material to work with.
And I would
My
say,
ethics students sometimes study this, and they know this from Bed Bag Dickie, a man who's written extensively about this issue, and it's a person, I think, Lee, that you would share much in common with.
and I think that those things are extremely important, but I would not make them more important than U.S. foreign policy. All of those things, including the tuition at this school and the cost of living in this area of the world, is partly contingent on the fact that, $800 billion has been spent in Iraq, and we don't want it, we'd rather watch an airplane crash? Well, I would say, yeah, maybe people do. Maybe people do. But we still have a responsibility. And the newspaper and the news reporter has to report it accurately.
Yes. Well, just to wrap up, what we're looking at is how issues are framed. And I think the point of dispute here is the framing caused because it's being dictated somehow by some union between business interests and publishers, or is it happening because of processes in the news media and things that the public are looking for? So thank you very much.
Experience for a lifetime.
At Purdue Calumet, you'll combine a Purdue education with rich, work-related experience that impresses employers.
Experience for a lifetime.
At Purdue Calumet, you'll take what you learn in the classroom and apply it to a real-world environment. At Purdue Calumet, you'll gain
Experience for a lifetime.
phone 1-800-HI-PURDUE, 1-800-HIPURDUE.